Disclaimer: this book may contain content that is considered historically inaccurate or culturally insensitive by modern standards. My hope is that by exploring old literature, we will better understand why people of the past thought the way that they did and understand the influences that shape their culture. This video is not intended for young audiences. Disclaimer about A Visit to Robinson Crusoe's Island. This does contain a lot of stereotypical attitudes, and I also apologize if I mispronounced any words. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I will be reading Out of Door Book, which is the 7th book in a series or a collection of books called The Children's Hour, which was published by Houghton Mifflin Co. in 1907. A Visit to Robinson Crusoe's Island by Richard Henry Dana. At daylight we saw the island of Juan Fernandez directly ahead, rising like a deep blue cloud out of the sea. We were then probably nearly 70 miles from it, and so high and so blue did it appear that I mistook it for a cloud resting over the island, and looked for the island under it, until it gradually turned to a deader and greener color, and I could mark the inequalities upon its surface. At length we could distinguish trees and rocks, and by the afternoon this beautiful island lay fairly before us, and we directed our course to the only harbor. Arriving at the entrance soon after sundown, we found a Chilean man-of-war brig, the only vessel coming out. She hailed us, and an officer on board, whom we supposed to be an American, advised us to run in before night, and said that they were bound to Valparaiso. We ran immediately for the anchorage, but, owing to the winds which drew about the mountains, and came to us in flaws from different points of the compass, we did not come to an anchor until nearly midnight. We had a boat ahead all the time that we were working in, and those aboard ship were continually bracing the yards about for every puff that struck us, until about 12 o'clock, when we came to in 40 fathoms water, and our anchor struck bottom for the first time since we left Boston, 103 days. We were then divided into 3 watches, and thus stood out the remainder of the night. I was called on deck to stand my watch at about 3 in the morning, and I shall never forget the peculiar sensation which I experienced on finding myself once more surrounded by land, feeling the night breeze coming from offshore, and hearing the frogs and crickets. The mountains seemed almost to hang over us, and apparently from the very heart of them there came out, at regular intervals, a loud echoing sound, which affected me as hardly human. We saw no lights, and could hardly account for the sound, until the mate, who had been there before, told us that it was the alerta of the Chilean soldiers, who were stationed over some convicts confined in caves nearly halfway up the mountain. At the expiration of my watch I went below, feeling not a little anxious for the day, that I might see more nearly, and perhaps tread upon, this romantic, I may almost say classic island. When all hands were called, it was nearly sunrise, and between that time and breakfast, although quite busy on board in getting up water casks, etc., I had a good view of the objects about me. The harbor was nearly landlocked, and at the head of it was a landing, protected by a small breakwater of stones, upon which 2 large boats were hauled up, with a sentry standing over them. Near this was a variety of huts or cottages, nearly 100 in number, the best of them built of mud or unburnt clay, and whitewashed, but the greater part Robinson Crusoe-like, only of posts and branches of trees. The governor's house, as it is called, was the most conspicuous, being large, with grated windows, plastered walls, and roof of red tiles, yet, like all the rest, only of 1 story. Near it was a small chapel, distinguished by a cross, and a long, low, brown-looking building, surrounded by something like a palisade, from which an old and dingy-looking Chilean flag was flying. This, of course, was dignified by the title of Presidio. A sentinel was stationed at the chapel, another at the governor's house, and a few soldiers, armed with bayonets, looking rather ragged, with shoes out at the toes, were strolling about among the houses, or waiting at the landing place for our boat to come ashore. The mountains were high, but not so overhanging as they appeared to be by starlight. They seemed to bear off towards the center of the island, and were green and well wooded, with some large and, I am told, exceedingly fertile valleys, with mule tracks leading to different parts of the island. I cannot here forget how Stimson and I got the laugh of the crew upon us I cannot here forget how Stimson and I got the laugh of the crew upon us by our eagerness to get on shore. The captain having ordered the quarter boat to be lowered, we both, thinking it was going ashore, sprang down into the forecastle, filled our jacket pockets with tobacco to barter with the people ashore, and when the officer called for 4 hands in the boat, nearly broke our necks in our haste to be the first over the side, and had the pleasure of pulling ahead of the brig with the tow line for half an hour, and coming on board again to be laughed at by the crew who had seen our maneuver. After breakfast, the second mate was ordered ashore with 5 hands to fill the water casks, and, to my joy, I was among the number. We pulled ashore with empty casks, and here again fortune favored me, for the water was too thick and muddy to be put into the casks, and the governor had sent men up to the head of the stream to clear it out for us, which gave us nearly 2 hours of leisure. This leisure we employed in wandering about among the houses, and eating little fruit which was offered to us, ground apples, melons, grapes, strawberries of an enormous size, and cherries abound here. The latter are said to have been planted by Lord Anson. The soldiers were miserably clad, and asked with some interest whether we had shoes to sell on board. I doubt very much if they had the means of buying them. They were very eager to get tobacco, for which they gave shells, fruit, etc. Knives were also in demand, but we were forbidden by the governor to let anyone have them, as he told us that all the people there, except the soldiers and a few officers, were convicts sent from Valparaiso, and that it was necessary to keep all weapons from their hands. The island, it seems, belongs to Chile, and had been used by the government as a penal colony for nearly 2 years, and the governor, an Englishman who had entered the Chilean navy, was, with a priest, half a dozen taskmasters, and a body of soldiers were stationed there to keep them in order. This was no easy task, and, only a few months before our arrival, a few of them had stolen a boat at night, boarded a brig lying in the harbor, sent the captain and crew ashore in their boat, and gone off to sea. We were informed of this, unloaded our arms, and kept strict watch on board through the night, and were careful not to let the convicts get our knives from us when on shore. The worst part of the convicts, I found, were locked up under sentry, in caves dug into the side of the mountain, nearly halfway up, with mule tracks leading to them, whence they were taken by day, and set to work under taskmasters upon building an aqueduct, a wharf, and other public works, while the rest lived in the houses which they put up for themselves, had their families with them, and seemed to me to be the laziest people on the face of the earth. They did nothing but take a passo in the woods, a passio among the houses, a passio at the landing place, looking at us and our vessel, and too lazy to speak fast, while the others were driven about at a rapid trot in single file, with burdens on their shoulders, and followed up by their taskmasters, with long rods in their hands, and broad-brimmed straw hats upon their heads. Upon what precise grounds this great distinction was made, I do not know, and I could not very well know, for the governor was the only man who spoke English upon the island, and he was out of my walk, for I was a sailor ashore as well as on board. Having filled our casks, we returned on board, and, soon after, the governor, dressed in a uniform like that of an American militia officer, the padre, in the dress of the Grey Friars, with hood and all complete, and the capitan, with big whiskers and dirty regimentals, came on board to dine. While at dinner, a large ship appeared in the offing, and soon afterwards we saw a light whaleboat pulling into the harbor. The ship lay off and on, and a boat came alongside of us, and put on board the captain, a plain young Quaker, dressed all in brown. The ship was the Cortez, whaleman of New Bedford, and had put in to see if there were any vessels from around the Horn, and to hear the latest news from America. They remained aboard a short time, and had a little talk with the crew, when they left us and pulled off to their ship, which, having sailed away, was soon out of sight. A small boat which came from the shore to take away the governor and suite, as they styled themselves, brought, as a present to the crew, a large pail of milk, a few shawls, and a block of sandalwood. The milk, which was the first we had tasted since leaving Boston, we soon dispatched. A piece of sandalwood I obtained, and learned that it grew on the hills in the center of the island. I regretted that I did not bring away other specimens, but what I had, the piece of sandalwood, and a small flower which I plucked and brought on board in the crown of my tarpaulin, and carefully pressed between the leaves of a volume of Cowper's letters, were lost, with my chest and its contents, by another negligence on our arrival home. About an hour before sundown, having stowed our water casks, we began getting under way, and were not a little while about it, for we were in 30 fathoms water, and in one of the gusts which came from offshore had let go our other bow anchor, and as the southerly wind draws round the mountains and comes off in uncertain flaws, we were continually swinging round, and had thus got a very foul hawse. We hove in upon our chain, and after stopping and unshackling it again and again, and hoisting and hauling down sail, we at length tripped our anchor and stood out to sea. It was bright starlight when we were clear of the bay, and the lofty island lay behind us in its still beauty, and I gave a parting look and bade farewell to the most romantic spot of earth that my eyes had ever seen. I did then, and have ever since, felt an attachment for that island altogether peculiar. It was partly, no doubt, from its having been the first land that I had seen since leaving home, and still more from the associations which everyone has connected with it in his childhood from reading Robinson Crusoe. To this I may add the height and romantic outline of its mountains, the beauty and freshness of its verdure, and the extreme fertility of its soil, and its solitary position in the midst of the wide expanse of the South Pacific, as all concurring to give it its charm. When thoughts of this place have occurred to me at different times, I have endeavored to recall more particulars with regard to it. It is situated in about 33 degrees 30' S, and is distant a little more than 300 miles from Valparaiso and the coast of Chile, which is in the same latitude. It is about 15 miles in length and 5 in breadth. The harbor in which we anchored, called by Lord Anson Cumberland Bay, is the only one in the island, 2 small bights of land on each side of the main bay, sometimes dignified by the name of bays, being little more than landing places for boats. The best anchorage is at the western side of the harbor, where we lay at about 3 cables' length from the shore, in a little more than 30 fathoms water. This harbor is open to the NNE, and in fact nearly from N to E, but the only dangerous winds being the southwest, on which side are the highest mountains, it is considered safe. The most remarkable thing, perhaps, about it is the fish with which it abounds. 2 of our crew, who remained on board, caught in a short time enough to last us for several days, and one of the men, who was a Marblehead man, said that he never saw or heard of such an abundance. There were cod, bream, silverfish, and other kinds, whose names they do not know, or which I have forgotten. There is an abundance of the best of water upon the island, small streams running through every valley, and leaping down from the sides of the hills. One stream of considerable size flows through the center of the lawn upon which the houses are built, and furnishes an easy and abundant supply to the inhabitants. This, by means of a short wooden aqueduct, was brought quite down to our boats. The convicts had also built something in the way of a breakwater, and were to build a landing place for boats and goods, after which the Chilean government intended to lay port charges. Of the wood, I can only say that it appeared to be abundant. The island in the month of November, when we were there, being in all the freshness and beauty of spring, appeared covered with trees. These were chiefly aromatic, and the largest was the myrtle. The soil is very loose and rich, and wherever it is broken up there spring up radishes, turnips, ground apples, and other garden fruits. Goats, we were told, were not abundant, and we saw none, though it was said we might, if we had gone into the interior. We saw a few bullocks winding about in the narrow tracks upon the sides of the mountains, and the settlement was completely overrun with dogs of every nation, kindred, and degree. Hens and chickens were also abundant, and seemed to be taken good care of by the women. The men appeared to be the laziest of mortals, and indeed, as far as my observation goes, there are no people to whom the newly invented Yankee word of loafer is more applicable than to the Spanish Americans. These men stood about doing nothing, with their cloaks, little better in texture than an Indian's blanket, but of rich colors, thrown over their shoulders with an air with an air which it is said that a Spanish beggar can always give to his rags, and with politeness and courtesy in their address, though with holes in their shoes, and without a sou in their pockets. The only interruption to the monotony of their day seemed to be when a gust of wind drew round between the mountains, and blew off the boughs which they had placed for roofs to their houses, and gave them a few minutes' occupation in running about after them. One of these gusts occurred while we were ashore, and afforded us no little amusement in seeing the men look round, and, if they found that their roofs had stood, conclude that they might stand too, while those who saw theirs blown off, after uttering a few Spanish oaths, gathered their cloaks over their shoulders, and started off after them. However, they were not gone long, but soon returned to their habitual occupation of doing nothing. It is perhaps needless to say that we saw nothing of the interior, but all who have seen it give favorable accounts of it. Our captain went with the governor and a few servants upon mules over the mountains, and, upon their return, I heard the governor request him to stop at the island on his passage home, and offer him a handsome sum to bring a few deer with him from California, for he said that there were none upon the island, and he was very desirous of having it stocked. A steady, though light southwesterly wind carried us well off from the island, and when I came on deck for the middle watch, I could just distinguish it from its hiding a few low stars in the southern horizon, though my unpracticed eyes would hardly have known it for land. At the close of the watch, a few trade wind clouds which had arisen, though we were hardly yet in their latitude, shut it out from our view, and the next day, Thursday, November 27th, upon coming on deck in the morning, we were again upon the wide Pacific, and saw no more land until we arrived upon the western coast of the great continent of America. Thank you for listening to Robinson Crusoe's Island A Visit to Robinson Crusoe's Island by Richard Henry Dana with me. I hope that you enjoyed it and that you're having a great day. Bye!